I don't know if any of you keep up with technology and the things that are happening in the world. I do, because I'm concerned about the next generation coming up, concerned about what's happening to our own generation, concerned about how things go. It's just who I am and what I be. And I say that to draw your attention to the image that I have up there. That is an artificial intelligence designed image. I went to an AI site where they only do text, and I said, design an image that shows grace exploding around the world. And it gave me 7 points. I then went to a site that does image design based on it, and I said the same thing. Give me an image that will show grace exploding around the world. I had about 7 options. This is the one I chose. And it fit almost exactly in line with the words that the text had given me as to making my own design. What this tells me is there is a potential out there for good, and there is a potential for evil. We've seen it every time technology makes an advance, but this time this is powerful. How can we tell the difference? How can we tell that that was not painted by an artist whom we may or may not know or have heard of? How can we tell that the words that we read were from the mind of someone thinking it through, or from this chatbot that is able to think, in quotes, think? How can we tell? With video manipulation, how can we tell when we watch a video that shows someone we don't like saying things we don't like, and then we go and find out that they never said it in the first place? We are left in a place of, which could be a quandary, a place where we need discernment. We need to pray over the things that we see and hear. We need to pray about those things. Ask God, what's the truth? Show me the truth. And trust His word. It says the Spirit of God will guide us into all truth. These are exciting times to live in. But we can be led astray easily by just staying within our own little box, and we follow what is called confirmation bias. We can find whatever it is we want to believe, we can find it confirmed easily, more easily now than when it was in the newspaper. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So I want to talk to you today about grace abounding in the world. We have recently changed the name of our church here in Stockton to Saved by Grace. Personally, I like the emphasis on grace and all that it implies. Our name shows that we believe in the grace of God for salvation. I've mentioned before that the Lord keeps me aware of the things going on in the world about, concerning His church. I know about the countries where the gospel is just growing by leaps and bounds, and yet the people will lose their job the next day if they're seen at a rally or a crusade and they become a Christian. I know of the countries where there's still secret home meetings going on because being open about your Christian faith is too dangerous to have. I also know about the grace explosion which is happening around the globe. There's a new 24-hour television network called Grace Awakening Network, or GAN, G-A-N is what they go by. The Lord is adding one more thing to the restoration of all things for His creation. Grace is an addition, something that's being restored because we're hearing it and learning about it in a way that has not been before, at least in our life. Now, Peter prophesied this restoration in his first sermon on Pentecost Sunday. In Acts chapter 3 and verse 21, he's talking about Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the times of restoration of all things, which God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. Now, the idea that something needs to be restored indicates that something has been broken in some fashion. It's been tainted, broken, dissolved, disappeared, but it needs to be restored. Now, obviously, when Peter uttered these words, he had to be referring to something before his time. We know that things took a turn for the worse when Adam and Eve forgot who they were and thought they needed to eat of the forbidden fruit in order to be like God. The serpent tempted Eve with, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Oh, wow. Really? I could be like God? How cool is that? Eve fell for this lie because she had not yet realized and accepted her identity as being in the image of God. For we read in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." They were already like God. But then they fell for the lie that you could be like God, which implied you're not like God. And so their minds got twisted. Human life began in the image of God. But Adam and Eve, and most of humankind since then, have failed to realize that reality. But that is something which is being restored to humans around the world. It is an awareness of who we really are. The psychologists, the motivational gurus, and the grace teachers are all trying to bring people to understand and know who you really are, your identity. Now, the church was born on Pentecost Sunday, which we celebrated only a few weeks ago. And the church was to bring the full knowledge of God to a lost and dying world. But the church, as Adam and Eve did, lost its sense of identity and went in a different direction. So allow me for just a few moments to take you through a very brief and fast survey of church history. What began in power soon became just another institution trying to preserve itself, because Emperor Constantine marched the Roman army into the river, said they were baptized, and proclaimed the Roman Empire to be Christian. Politics and religion were soon married, and the world entered into the Dark Ages. Martin Luther began to question what he was serving after he began reading the Bible. What is known as the Protestant Reformation began with Luther and John Calvin and others as they sought to remove the church from the grasp of the elite. Now, as we trace that time of the Reformation until the modern times of today, we can see a steady restoration of different doctrines or teachings that the church is supposed to have, which lend themselves to a greater freedom for the people. The Reformation brought out salvation by grace instead of works. Then came John Wesley and his emphasis on personal holiness. Then there was the Great Awakening as evangelism was taken out of the four walls of the church and into the streets. Next came the Pentecostal outpouring. The church began to experience the reality of the Holy Spirit influencing their life. Then came the charismatic movement which brought about an awareness of the various gifts of the Spirit beyond just speaking in tongues and prophecy. Now that movement, the charismatic movement, also saw a rise in the importance of teachers. It is the teachers who have brought us to the current place of grace awareness. Now, all the things I've mentioned so far are in the Bible. We just didn't see them because they were hidden until the time of restoration that God had ordained. Now, even though Paul mentioned the increase of grace among the people in his time, it did not become a reality until the time in which we are now alive. We read this morning in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 15, "For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God." Paul was talking about here the reality of grace, not just the teaching or the doctrine. And the grace of God was on a rampage at that time throughout the Roman Empire, and people's lives were being changed. But then Augustine brought in his legalism, and the rampage died down to a trickle. Today, the biblical understanding of grace is being taught, and there is a tsunami of grace awakening around the world. It's sweeping people up in ways it's hard to imagine. Now, I have seen bits and pieces of this awakening, the understanding. I've had bits and pieces show up little by little in my 50 years of ministry. But now there is a solid basis of understanding being written and proclaimed through any and every means possible. Like I mentioned, a network devoted entirely. The awareness of grace and its importance in our life and understanding is also being met with great resistance. So what else is new among the people of God, right? Jesus came bringing a teaching that was not taught in their synagogues, and he was persecuted for that. Paul came bringing a teaching and understanding that did not measure up to the standards of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work your tail off, and God just might let you into his heaven. He was also persecuted for that. Augustine came along, the Bishop of Hippo, and he decided that Paul's understanding was less than adequate, so he taught the church that it was necessary to work your way into heaven. He was not persecuted, but revered. His teaching took hold, and we are only now beginning to recover from the lie of salvation by works and good deeds. Now, as a result, many people today are resisting any teaching that might bring freedom to the people. I shared one of those bits and pieces that I was learning in the 80s in my home church down in Springfield. I shared it on a Sunday morning. That night, the pastor used an angry tone as he tried to refute everything I had said. Now, Paul had to deal with the same thing, as people could not understand the freedom which grace brings to a life. There's freedom. These people would pick up on a minor point and try to use logic to refute his teachings. We read in Romans chapter 6 and verse 1 where Paul writes, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound?" He's saying what people were arguing from. They made that assumption based on his prior statement that we read in chapter 5 and verse 20, that the law came in to increase the trespass. But where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. So you can see where they get their so-called logic from. Oh, goody, let's sin so there'll be more grace. No. I'm sure you can see how they would arrive at such nonsense. But that is the accusation which is being leveled against me and other teachers today. People say that we are just giving people a license to sin. However, as I mentioned last time, this only reveals a lack of understanding of God's grace. They don't understand. His grace is what helps us not to sin. That's what we read in Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. Notice that it's grace, not law, that teaches us this. That's what grace is. The grace of God is our only antidote for the sin in our life, which keeps us from experiencing the full freedom that we have in the Lord. Now, as God is restoring this freedom to His church, there will be many who simply cannot or will not see or agree with it. But that's the history and nature of mankind. We simply have a hard time with change. There are people who complain that there is very little preaching today against sin anymore. They want to hear some hellfire and brimstone preached from the pulpit. One person came up to the pastor one Sunday and said, "Why don't you preach against sin?" The pastor asked, "Well, which sin would you like me to preach against?" "Oh, I don't know. How about adultery?" The pastor said, "Is that your sin?" "Well, no." "Then how would it help you if I preached against adultery?" Pointing out what's wrong and trying to scare people into heaven just doesn't work anymore. Now, God may have used it at one time, but not today. Why doesn't preaching about hell and preaching against sin work anymore? Well, the main reason is that it does not have much of a biblical basis, and God has been restoring an understanding of scriptural teaching and understanding and faith in that. You will go blind, I promise you. You will go blind trying to find where Paul or any other New Testament writer spent any time preaching about hell. It's not there. Why is that? Because grace, mercy, forgiveness, and love are much more powerful than fear. As we saw last time, love chases fear right out the door. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Now, my experience has been over the past few years that the more that I understand the grace of God for all people, the more easily I find myself loving others. And I hope that you too will become a part of this awakening of grace and fulfill what Paul was saying in this aspect of restoration, where he said, "For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God." May each of us be a vessel which the Lord uses to extend grace to more and more people so that God may be glorified. Amen.